with NextJS at Asurion. And yeah, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. Cool. Yeah. So as you all know, the topic we'll be discussing today is NextJS and kind of the ways we leveraged it and used it to improve performance at Asurion. And just kind of I want to go over some basics. So just a little bit of an intro. My name is Muhamed. I'm a senior software engineer at Asurion. I've been with Asurion for some time now, and we work on a lot of really cool stuff. I mean, Will's there as well with us, and so we'll talk a little bit about Asurion later on as we dive into the specific problem statements. But yeah, we'll move on. Before we continue, I just want to kind of give an outline of what we'll talk about today. So specifically, kind of the problem statements that we ran into at Asurion, and kind of where NextJS came in. We want to talk about kind of the what NextJS is, the why, like why we picked it and why we decided to go this route, and also the how, right? Because we in our specific use case, we already had an application that was in React, and it's you can start a NextJS application from scratch, kind of like you would create React app. In our case, we wanted to migrate, and that's a process of its own. And so we kind of wanted to showcase kind of how that process is as well, right? How easy or difficult, right, it is. And then specifically talking about NextJS, one of the obviously the acronyms that come with NextJS is SSR, right? Server-side rendering. That's kind of what it's most known for. So we want to go over kind of the different methods of rendering and kind of compare and see where NextJS and where SSR fits into kind of the different ways of rendering and different ways of building an application and showing it to users. And we talked about kind of the how, and that's kind of where we add. We'll next get into the migrating from a Create React app and kind of the high level things. Obviously, there's a lot more to it. Maybe some applications might be more complex than others, but we'll look at kind of the basic steps to at least migrate, and then we'll look at some results. We're very KPI driven. We were very data driven here at Asurion. So we wanted to make sure as we went through the process of migrating that we kept track of okay, what how was our performance and the time it took to render, how much data we're passing, when you're getting a user to download the application, the before and after of all that, right? Using things like Lighthouse and First Temple Paint and stuff like that. And we'll get into that data as well, because we want to have something we can measure and look at the before and after. And then what I'd like to do, after all this is kind of share a sample project. So we'll do a few things like kind of highlight the differences between a normal Create React app or just a normal React app that's kind of hosted and served on S3. And then, share the differences between that and NextJS. And, there are some caveats with NextJS, things like how you organize your app, the folder structure and all that stuff. And so we'll go over some of the differences there. We'll also look at the way that NextJS helps you optimize. There are a lot of things that it does automatically for you. So we'll look at some of those, and we'll look at some ways we can do server-side rendering and how you would use that, and how you can benefit from moving your API calls, for example, to a server-side rendering call instead. Cool. That's enough of an outline. Just want to give some background. First of all, mostly kind of where we had approached NextJS within Asurion. So the team that I'm on specifically is, kind of building it was something called Asurion ID, which is kind of like an OIDC authentication for our customers. It kind of backs a lot of our applications. And so, it's a as far as an application, React application, it's light as far as the front end code, but because it's uniquely positioned fronting many application logins, we were getting a lot of feedback to make sure that it's faster and like loaded faster from a user perspective, right? Another key goal of ours was conversion, right? How long it takes to load the application and a user to log in is very important to us, right? And then other consideration we kept in mind when we were kind of evaluating all this was like, how long does it take for the initial page to render, right? And how much we can improve in places like bundle size, right? For mobile or low bandwidth users in this case. So this is kind of just a background of the considerations we had in mind. So with this, just wanted to kind of just go ahead and dive right into what NextJS and SSR is. So like we have our goals. We wanted to improve our performance of our application. We wanted to like make the load time much faster, less bundle size, and kind of give a better experience to all of the applications running our login system. So we'll go into what NextJS and SSR is. Sorry, let me just defer a update. Okay, so what is NextJS? It was started by Versal. I think they were previously called Zid. I probably mispronounced both of these. Apologies, but they're an open source JavaScript framework and built off of React. Allows you to build extremely fast performance sites with static and server generated HTML in mind. And they were released in 2016. And they're most known as far as like if you go read a lot of blog posts and you go read a lot of like what is NextJS, kind of the word or the acronym that usually like follows it is like, yes, SSR, but then also like it's great for SEO, right? Because it gives you a lot of that performance and like that helps play a factor into your lighthouse score. And then obviously you kind of, the other things that come as part of that as well. And then, it allows you to do both client-side rendering and server-side rendering, and it handles a lot of that for you. And it basically came and kind of became like a de facto server-side rendering platform, right? Like it allowed users. It basically brought this back into the scene again. The web application ecosystem has always shifted from server-side rendering in the past to more client-side rendering. So it's this tug of war, and NextJS, when it kind of got introduced, kind of brought this back into the picture again. And it's a leading industry framework as well. So like all these big companies, Netflix, GitHub, Docker, like Hulu, CBS, like all these big companies are like leveraging this, right? It's not something small. On to the next. And I just listed a few of these. Obviously, there's way more benefits to this, but sometimes it's good to know that if you know React, right, it's very easy to pick up already, and it has very, very it's a huge community support, right? It's sometimes it's one of the things we consider when we look at a new framework, a new library, is like how well is this in the community, right? How much support does it have? Is it getting constantly updated and stuff? And NextJS is one that gets a lot of support and like has their own conference yearly as well, where they introduce some of their new features and kind of they obviously build a lot of that with their existing like deployment features and they have their own little ecosystem there. But NextJS alone just has its own release and like open source community, which is great. It's very practical for like especially content heavy applications. When you wanting to load a lot of heavy, content heavy application that you wanted to like delegate to like your backend to do, right, for a user, and that's it's very practical there. It has all these other like really cool features that you can leverage. I know that recently announced like a middleware to handle like things like feature flags. You can use it for like A/B testing and bringing a lot of this into your server-side rendering, right? This is things. These are things that like instead of you handling this on the client side, you could delegate this to be done on the server, right? Instead of me rendering, showing the HTML, getting the JavaScript, and then deciding what to render based on A/B test, I will pass that, I will delegate that to the server to say, okay, should this feature be shown versus this feature? And then it'll generate an HTML and pass it to the front end. And that process has already been done, right? All before it's gone to the user's device. So how it works, so basically what I want to talk about next is kind of setting a good foundation about the different methods of rendering. And we talked a little bit about this in the outline, but there's kind of the three kind of core methods of rendering. We talked a little bit about client-side rendering, and then server-side rendering, and there's also like static-side generators, which kind of fit into this as well, right? Gatsby is probably one of the most well-known ones. Jekyll and others like basically generating HTML. So I think what I want to go through with this specific slide is start from left to right and kind of outline what happens in each one of those and what the user sees. And that's the most important thing in this aspect is what's happening in each step and the user's experiences in each one of these steps, and kind of where specifically server-side rendering fits into play, because we'll talk about this a little bit more later. So on the left, I guess we'll start from these client-side rendering. So basically, the browser here makes a requested HTML file from the server. The server responds back with a simple HTML file. So like if you have a query React app and you have your index.html, and it's like that element, that root element in there that like React kind of hooks into in the index.js. Basically, that if you double click and open that file, it's basically an empty HTML, right? It needs the JavaScript to be bootstrapped first. It needs the assets like the CSS or the fonts and all that stuff to be available. So what happens is, when you first download that HTML file, the time it takes to go and get the other assets, get the JavaScript, get the CSS to execute, and then render it, and then bootstrap it, and then like generate an HTML, an updated HTML to then render to the user, right? There's a time it takes for all that to happen. And so like, it might be really short, it might be really long, depending on like the asset size. But that's kind of the big differentiator here between client-side rendering and server-side rendering, right? It's a brief period of time where you're waiting for the asset to be loaded before you can even show anything to the user, right? And then at the bottom, it says application ready to use after application fetch all the data it needs and inject it into the DOM. And on the middle here, we have the server-side rendering. And so similarly, where we make the browser request, getting to get the HTML from the server, we fetch all the data we need in the server to render the application, and we basically generate an HTML on the fly. So what that means is, like, if I know at a bare minimum that the application at its default state, right, will look like this, or I have an API that can go and fetch data and provide that to the HTML, to React, or to a component to render, the server will handle generating the base or the current state of HTML for you and give that back to the browser. Now, with that in mind, we still haven't downloaded the JavaScript assets yet, right? That still has to happen. React may not have bootstrapped yet, but at minimum, what you're doing is you're giving an HTML to the user, something visible, something that they can digest right away. And then, while that's happening in that small period of time where the JavaScript is being fetched and the assets are being fetched, you have something visible to the user. And then obviously the application is ready to load once all the other assets are downloaded. But it's a much better experience here because you're not having to wait, right? However long that wait is, could be like a flash or like a white flash of the page or like a loading indicator, what have you. That's all avoided in the server-side rendering, right? And in static side generators, obviously, in this case, you know you're basically generating the HTML and all the different routes and permutation of this is done at build time. So you know exactly what the HTML will include, and there's no need to go and really wait. And this is kind of where this is more similar to server-side rendering in the sense that like you're given HTML ahead of time and you're able to show that to the user right away. But obviously in this case, it's all static. So each one of these is just an HTML that you just show as you go from route to route, right? Again, Gatsby is probably the best example of this. Cool. All right, so now that we have that kind of foundation, I want to talk about the NextJS migration and kind of what steps it takes to go from a Query React app, which is, again, most folks are familiar with this, into a NextJS. And what this will do is kind of outline some of the key differences, and we'll talk about the why, right? And so just high level, NextJS is, as far as the documentation goes, they have like a really good documentation, and they specifically have a page that talks about how to go from Create React App to NextJS. Obviously, this can vary between different applications based on how complex your application is. Whether you need to, if you're not a ejected Create React app, it might be a little bit easier. But if you've got all this, custom Webpack configuration that you might need to like port over and make sure it works. So again, it can vary from complexity based on the application, but at a high level, this is kind of the standouts of things that will have to happen if you are migrating, right? NextJS has a different folder structure that's a little bit more strict, and just in some areas, specifically, they have because NextJS handles something called automatic automatic site optimization. What they do is as you're building the application, it will go through all of your pages, and specifically, I will get into the pages part later, but your routes are in all your pages and or routes, I should say, are in a specific pages folder. And that's one of the most strict things that NextJS offers, is that it requires you to have all your pages routes in a specific folder, so it knows where to go look for those. Obviously this eliminates the need to use something like a React router, for example, because they have their own router. And by doing so, by having everything in a separate pages folder, they can go and they can look at every single one of these pages at build time, and they can say, okay, this looks like something that does not have any dynamic data, so I will render a static HTML for them. So it actually is smart enough that it can go and look at all your pages and know whether this requires some server-side rendering, and so it won't automatically create an HTML for you, or you can even have static generated content where at build time it can go fetch from an API, something like maybe Contentful or what have you, and pull like a blog post, for example, and similar to Gatsby will inject that and then generate a static HTML. So those are the three ways that it can help optimize for you, or like we'll look at the routes in your pages folder and try to like build off of that. So because all of our routes are in a pages folder, we don't have a dedicated index.html anymore. So what we have now is basically a component called _document. And this _document is basically treated as like a route as well. And what it will do is it will, you can put all of your like third-party scripts and like meta tags and like header, like all that stuff will go into this document, and NextJS will know how to handle those automatically for you. And so what ends up next after this is the _app, which also is again a file, or you could say like a route, but it's basically the app is the way that as you go from route to route, because each route is treated as a HTML file that's generated of its own. So how do we consolidate all these? How do we persist things between the different routes and pages? That's where kind of the app comes in. Now what this _app component does, it lets you persist state and as you're going from route to route, it can help let you like have routes talk to each other, or like persist. Like let's say you have like a global storage or something like that. You would like have these as a provider in here, for example. The next thing that they have is a next config file. And this basically is a NextJS specific config file in the root, and it lets you define some NextJS specific things that it will use for build time, and even lets you extend things like the Webpack if you needed to, like have your own custom Webpack configuration. And then any assets that are part of your application are, like any images and what have you, they have a public folder where you can put all those images in and reference as well, similar to Query React App. But in this case, these assets kind of live with the application as server. You could also give it a, that's by default, but you could give it like a CD, and you can deploy your assets to like an S3 if you wanted to. And then finally, and one of the most important ones is, because NextJS handles rendering in the server as an option, you basically have to then go and check across your entire application areas that you are looking at, like the window, DOM, or anywhere that the browser, obviously the server itself does not have access to the window object or the document. So you basically have to put those into either like if statements, if else statements, or put in those into like use effects to say, hey, only run this check when you are in the client, not in the server. That's one other caveat there to just be mindful of, is that not everything can be ran in the server itself, right? Especially things that like need access to like the window or the document. And we'll go through some of this, and we'll showcase specifically the differences when we get to the kind of the code section. So just want to kind of also use this time to like showcase the different ways, specifically for our application. We had to show you the architecture of this between kind of what was there before NextJS and what was there after NextJS. So this is the pre-NextJS one. Again, this is pretty high level. So what ended up happening is we have users who go through our Route 53, and we have Kubernetes clusters in the back end. So because this is an OAuth OIDC experience, we basically return back and we call it non-generated HTML, but basically it's an empty HTML. So similar to any React app, the first thing that would get returned is an empty HTML that would then go and fetch the assets from like somewhere like CloudFront. And then that CloudFront would go into, fetch it from the assets from like S3 or like some storage again, and then return back the JavaScript, the CS, and stuff like that. So the time the only time it takes, the time it takes for the application to finally like render, to show something to the user, is the flow 2 at the bottom for that to fully complete, right? Because we need the JavaScript to be bootstrapped. We need React to be bootstrapped before we can like render anything on the client side. So this is kind of like very, very common scenario, for create React app applications, right? Usually you have your assets in S3, and by the time the index is brought and assets are pulled in, then you can finally show something to the user. So after we implemented NextJS, what ended up happening is we have our OAuth requests, for our login experience, went to Route 53. And what we added an Express server in our Kubernetes instance, Express pod. And what that does is it will generate, because we have some context, we have some like information about the user as they're coming in. And that's one of the key differences here, is that like, whether you have this information or not, it's vital to say like, okay, in the server, what is the closest thing that I can generate for the user so that I can show them something instead of a blank white page. So in our case, we have some data, some information about this we call session, and we use that to generate an HTML, right? Pre-generated HTML, so that when this is returned back to the client, the user sees something, and in that small amount of time, whether it's a second or like less, we go and fetch the rest of the assets, the JavaScript, CSS, and etc. But the user has seen something at this point, right? They've seen an HTML that had some elements and all. It's not just an empty white page, right? And that's a key differentiator here, right? And you'll notice as well that we also don't have an S3 bucket here for our assets because they live right in the server itself. But we did put a CloudFront behind that as well, which you can do as an option, right? If you wanted to eliminate the need to have an S3 bucket, but still have CloudFront. And then some performance information. So this is just, again, some high level stuff, but before we added NextJS, our Lighthouse score is not bad for our application. And if you're not familiar with Lighthouse, it's just, it's kind of Google Chrome's way of measuring the performance of your application. You can, go to the dev tools and open it up and run it. And there's a lot of metrics that it gives you, but we just looked at a few just to kind of help us kind of capture what was important to us. So our Lighthouse score was kind of hovering between 85, 86, and our largest contentful paint, which is, we'll take a second to talk about that. But basically what that is largest contentful paint is seen as what is something meaningful we can show to the user, how long it takes to show something meaningful to the user, right? So in our case, it took us about 2.5 seconds to show something meaningful to our users, right? And that's kind of based on Lighthouse's score. And then, our initial render in kilobytes was about almost a little bit over a megabyte. After NextJS, we basically got this bumped up to a 99 Lighthouse score. And actually, this post NextJS performance was without any server-side rendering either. So what I'm showing you here was us we were doing just the migration and not changing any of the way we are doing our rendering, right? After we actually migrated some of our APIs to run through the server-side rendering, the largest contentful paint there on the right side you see actually dropped as well. So it dropped to 0.5 seconds, so a whole 2-second savings there, which is pretty fantastic. And then obviously our initial render went down by half because obviously some of the assets we downloaded, some of the JavaScript assets, NextJS does a good job of splitting up all your assets and chunking them out, I guess is probably the better terminology. And only rendered what we needed for that specific route at that time. And again, this is kind of, I'm mostly showing you all this because I wanted to be mindful of what does it take for a base, migration from Create React App to NextJS. With some of the savings, we got a 30% decrease in largest contentful paint time, a 1.1 second savings in load time, and our decrease in initial kilobyte load time by half. Again, just keeping in mind that this was before we did our other addition, which was the server-side rendering that NextJS provided, because it was good for me to call out just how much NextJS gives you out of the box, which is pretty powerful. We had a 2-second saving from load time every time the user loaded the page for the first time, just from migrating some of our APIs to server-side rendering. Cool. So I think that's enough PowerPoint slides. We'll go into some of the code now, and specifically, just be mindful of the time as well. But I want to look at a couple of things about the differences between NextJS and Create React App, and then we'll look at the folder structure, the build output. I think is one of my favorites. Just seeing kind of what NextJS spits out versus what a Create React App spits out. And then we'll kind of look at some of this running locally, and we'll show you the application as an example and see the differences there, right? All right, so let me first open up, and I'll have this project published to GitHub if anyone wants to see these two or use them as an example after this meet. Yeah. So this is kind of a normal pre-React app, and well, let me know if you all can't see this, if I need to increase the font size. This is a pre-NextJS, so meaning just a normal pre-React app. Folder structure is pretty similar as well. We have kind of our app. We've got our, I have two routes here, some components, something basic, CSS, and obviously our index.js, which, in this case, I've got my routes here in this index.js, which has the base path of app. And then I have two routes, something called a color palette generator and then facts generator, just two APIs that I'm using as
Muhamed, do you mind bumping the font up just a little bit?
I sure can. Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is kind of our basic routes. This is pretty straightforward for folks who might be familiar with React, create React app. We've got our routes and in this case, I've kind of put them here. No like specific folder structure or strict folder structure, you could say, components and CSS. And then obviously our HTML is listed here. So, normally if I were to open this HTML file, we don't have anything generated already, right? It'll just load an empty page. And this is what we were talking about earlier when we said, like, this is the first thing that gets to the browser. And until React is bootstrapped, and until React basically appends its kind of generated HTML to this section, until then, it will continue to show our white page. So moving to a NextJS application, want to highlight some of the key differences there. The biggest we talked about earlier is the way that we handle routes, right? We don't have an HTML file per se, kind of like we did with well, I guess this HTML file is probably copied over. Sorry about that. But the HTML file from this is probably when I migrated and I forgot to delete these. So ignore that. But the routes themselves are in this pages folder. So if I were to go to the base path like / it would load this component, this page, right? If I went to like the colors generator route, it would show this component. So I don't have like a React router that's managing this. Essentially, NextJS is managing all this for me. And the way it's kind of maintaining a lot of this is in this kind of, especially for like when we talk about like shared state, is in this underscore app, right? And then we talked about other things like if you wanted to include like your title and head and like any other like scripts, you would include them in like a document, for example, right? So this all has basically satisfied a few things. We talked about this filling in the space that in the index HTML did before, and our routes, and obviously the index.tsx and app.tsx, right? Other differences that NextJS we talked about here, because we have a server as well. So in this case, I've added an Express server that's kind of backing a lot of this. And this is just a simple Express server that like, this is all probably it takes really all you would really need to get this application running on a server. So we don't have any other like logic that we want to handle to just handle the server-side rendering, right? We have this specific next wrapper that kind of goes around your next application that handles the server-side generating of your application itself, which is pretty cool. And then we talked about the next config as well. So I've included this, and specifically I've added style components just as an example to show like you can, update your next config file to support any of this. You can also add things like, let's say your assets are not stored next to the server. Let's say they're stored in some sort of like CDN. You could have like a base path configuration where you can define a base path for all of your assets, and NextJS will pick that up at build time to point to like the S3 bucket or what have you. or your CloudFront URL. So that's really some of the biggest differences. And like as far as just migrating, and then you have to think about the other things as well. One of them was, for example, this. I've kind of just added this console log here in the app, and I'll run this locally, and we'll actually see this happening. But adding checks to see if the application is running on a server or in the browser. This is one of the ways that we'll be able to identify, like, okay, if the window is not defined, then don't run this. Like, let's say, for example, I wanted to run some set up and some analytics, or I wanted to like run some logic to say like only do this when you are in the client side. I would either add some if check, or I could do some like use effect here, because use effects only get run on the client side. Okay, so that's kind of the big differentiators between like a normal query React app and a NextJS application. And I believe I have the normal one running right now. So let me get this running. And I just want to highlight a few key differences. And I think I already had one running as well. So, okay. So this is just, again, our demo application. Hopefully you all can see that. Okay, I can zoom in a little bit more. Okay, this is just the Query React app application for now. And it just does two things. It has two routes. I go to one, it will generate a fact for me using an API, and the other one will give me a color palette. And I want to call out just what happened there. So you notice that the loading indicator showed as soon as I went onto this route. And that's kind of one of the key important differences here is like, as I loaded this route or this page, the client had to handle the API call, waiting for the API call to come back, and then rendering something to the user. And similarly for this fact generator as well, like you show the loading indicator, waiting for something to happen. So, if I wanted to like delegate this to the server, right? If I didn't want this to be run on the user side, let's say we wanted to run this, maybe this is a lot more data, right, that I'm fetching. Maybe the user's on a really slow device, or like really, really poor, poor performance, or like even network. All this could be delegated to the server to be ran and given back just an HTML, right? And now in this case, obviously I have the JavaScript and all that already loaded. So the loading indicator is just the API call. But if I was just to load this page from the start, right? Like this is the first page that I'm loading. I'm forced to use a loading indicator because obviously the React is not bootstrapped yet. And I'm kind of waiting for all of that process to be done before I can even call the API and load that. So this is kind of the base of the Query React app. And I want to show the difference when we start to move some of this into NextJS and start to use server-side rendering, and kind of, you can really see the difference there in the performance. So I'll stop this one, and then we'll go into our post-NextJS. I'm going to just run the dev server. And again, this is running an Express server locally as well, and obviously running NextJS. All right, so got our server running. And I'll open the console because I think it's good to see a couple of things while we're looking at this. So I'll go ahead and load the same route we did before. And you'll notice that a couple of things happened. So like we basically completely ignored the need to run a show loading indicator, because if I look at the console, I fetched these colors from the server itself and was able to generate an HTML. And so I'll go to the code specifically where this is happening, and we can look at what's going on here. But in my, in this case, post Next.js page gets colors. Next.js has these things called, I guess you call them like different ways of rendering, but like it's ways that Next.js knows at build time. In this case, it's called get server side props, and this is just a function you can include in any of your routes. And when Next.js sees this on the server, or even at build time, if you are using something called get static props runs at build time. What Next.js is doing here is it will go and try to make this API call and get the output of that API call and return it back to this specific component, this specific route or page as props. So what I'm doing here is essentially I'm fetching a list of colors, right? This color palette from this color palette API. Awaiting it, getting the result back, and then I'm returning it as props to my component here, right? So the way we know that this is being run and generated on a server is I was able to console log this out on the Express server side here, and you can tell that because this was done on the server, and it came through here and it generated this HTML based on this, I guess these set of colors, right? So it kind of mapped through the colors and kind of rendered them on the page. That's kind of in contrast to the create React app one where like I would have to like put this in I have to have like a loading state where I put this behind a use effect, call this, and maybe wait until the loading indicator, wait until the API call is done, and then finally show something meaningful to the user in this case, right? That's where kind of the one of the key differences there between Next.js and Create React App, and this is specifically the server-side rendering part. And so,
hey, Muhammad, you may touch on this in a second, but I was going to mention with the server-side props function that you export on a page, if after your initially server-side render page is hydrated with your client, your React client, and you navigate to another page, that server-side props call is also executed on subsequent pages, but it's actually doing it over a fetch call. And it basically exposes like a mini endpoint for your page to fetch that data. Could you touch on that too when you get a chance?
You're talking about subsequently after you go through this?
Yeah. So say for example, you're on the home page and you click on the palette page. In the browser, the actual browser is going to make a fetch call to like /colors.json, right? So it's actually running this function to grab the data and pulling it in after the page has been hydrated on the initial page load.
Correct. Yes. For before Next.js, and then with Next.js,
right,
the server itself would be going and handling this API call for you when you have the get server side props. So this is actually one of the you could say cons of Next.js is if your application requires you to make a lot of API calls, right? Let's say you're doing a lot of like updates to your application, right? Let's say that was kind of like constantly running, or like data that needed to be updated like often and real time. Like you don't, that would be a hit on your server, for example, right? You don't want to be calling get server side props over and over and over again. It's mostly just like I get my data and then I provide it to my application, right? It's not the kind of thing that you would use to, call. Like, again, this would be a performance on your server that you would need to take into consideration when you choose Next.js to see how often your users would be calling your Next.js server, right? But yeah, I guess like you said, the differentiator there is once, let's say I'm coming from the main route, you'll notice that, and I'll refresh the page as well, where it says I'm setting up analytics. That is only done on the client side, right? Because I put that if check in the _app, right? So it checks to see if my window object is available. If not, it won't. And then if it is, which again, it runs this on the client side as well, then it console logs that out. And so, I think kind of similar to what you were talking about, Will, is when I render this page and I'm fetching this, all the assets that I'm fetching at this point in time for specifically NextJS are assets specific to this page, right? And in this case, like I am not making any API calls in this. I'm not, I'm just mostly fetching a very static HTML. Like as it stands right now, this HTML itself is very static. So we'll look at the build output of this, but NextJS will generate an HTML file for me for this because it automatically knows. It says, look, you're not doing any kind of oddity as far as like fetching any data or like dynamically rendering any data. So it will go and optimize this page for me and generate an HTML. Kind of in contrast to that is if I go into this color palette generator, obviously we're running it locally. So like, we're fetching this, using localhost. So like this is not actually the production version, so maybe a little bit degraded performance, but it will go and fetch the assets specifically needed for this page. And that's kind of in comparison to like Query React app, it will go and fetch all the JavaScript and all the CSS and all the fonts and all that for the entire application and figure out what it needs to load at that point in time then.
Yeah, I was talking, see that colors.json call there?
Yeah.
So that's the actual page props that's being
props, right?
Okay, cool.
Correct. Yeah, and that's something that you don't get with the Query React app because obviously you have to run that API call on the client side.
Cool.
Cool. So if there's no questions, I think what I'll do next is I'll show, especially the big differences between the build outputs of both of these applications, right? And we can see kind of what NextJS gives to you out of the box here. So I'll start with the pre-NextJS and just kind of run a build. And then we can see kind of what it gives you and even try to like serve it, right? Or just even open it up in the folder, it's fine too. Cool. Okay, so what our build now shows is we've got some JavaScript and some JavaScript chunks and some CSS after this. And I can look at that in my pre-NextJS build folder. So again, we have our HTML file, right? And by itself, I really can't really do anything with this, right? I have to have the JavaScript loaded. So when the index.html is loaded by the server or by the S3 bucket for the first time, once it lands on the client, on the user's browser, then it will say, okay, go fetch me this JavaScript. I can just, I can clean this up a little bit. It'll say, go fetch me this, this JavaScript file and then this CSS file and all that stuff. And then we'll go and grab those for you as well. And then I'll go ahead and build the NextJS one, and we can kind of see what that looks like. Give that a second. Cool. And this is one of the cool things that NextJS also does for you at build time. It has this kind of this legend, similar to this, but like it has this legend that will tell you based on like your pages, and that's kind of one of the things that really NextJS highlights a lot is like it calls routes pages, but it will tell you how it scours through all of your pages and treated each one of those pages when it came to optimizations, right? So anything that was like, I guess, an empty circle was treated as a static HTML, right? And by that, it went and automatically rendered a static HTML, right? So, for example, my app, and we talked about this earlier as well, right? The app itself, this specific page did not make any API calls, did not, do anything to be dynamic. So it basically went and optimized it and built an HTML for me out of the box. It comes with its own 404 page, and it built that as a static. The facts page, I did not convert this yet to a server-side rendered API. So it treated that as a static one, right? Static and only dynamic at on the client side. This, I guess, Lambda symbol, this is where it identified that it uses get server-side props, and when it finds that exported function, and it will treat that as a server-generated application, or server-generated page, I should say. And so it found this, and it said, okay, I'm not going to try to do any crazy optimizations. I will try to render as much as I can for the other pages, but for this one, it will try to provide with you as much as you can before it can run on the server. And so we can go look into the actual folder structure and actually see how it tried to build all this. So this is kind of the chunks, you could say, the build folder. So we've got our 404 HTML page, 500 HTML page, and so even our index.html page. And so let me open this in the Finder, and I'll ask you to just go ahead and open this. And what's cool is, like, yeah, I don't have obviously the fonts, but I have almost everything else. Like this is when I compare this to as a starting HTML to something like what the Create React app provided out of the box, which was this one. I guess I should probably go to the build folder, but compare this one to this one. Like I'm getting like automatically NextJS has provided this for me. Like out of the box, it's great. Like what NextJS does for you, it knows that, hey, I will generate this for you at build time, and you don't even have to I didn't even have to pick this as an option. It automatically optimized my application for me, and that's where even just migrating your application on a simple level without even trying to do any server generated functions, NextJS will go and try to find ways to automatically help make your application faster, right? So in this case, our main route, it went and said, this is static. So I will treat it as a static page, and I will generate as much of the HTML. So what happens here is when I load this page, when I serve this, this is the first thing that gets sent on this route before the JavaScript and all that is even loaded inside of a blank white page, which I know it was pretty mind blowing to me when I first found out. It's pretty cool. And then one of the other things I wanted to do is, just kind of showcase real quick how you would go about converting a, say, an API call or what have you to a server, server generated, right? In this case, we have our Packs API, and I've kind of already completed it here, but essentially what we had is this loading indicator that was we were using for our state to determine whether to wait or not. We can get rid of that because we don't really need that anymore. We are going to move this fetch call to the server generated one, server side props, so we can get rid of that. And again, I could do this. I could even make this run on get static props, right? And using get static props would have just run this at build time and generated that fact for me, and it would show that on the HTML. I could remove the loading indicator here and just show the fact component itself. Right? By doing so, I also need to, I guess I can get rid of this at state because I'm not really relying on state anymore. But what I will rely on now is I will rely on the server to give me that prop, right? The same way you would rely on, like, let's say this is a child component, let's say a parent component needed to provide you that as props. This is why this felt so natural to me coming from Create React App, is that NextJS kind of treats this as like props, right? It's like, hey, you're expecting that data. So your components, you just digest it as they would receive that prop from any other parent component, which, I think it makes migrating to this a lot more simpler. And so this is kind of what that would look like now, which is I'll get a fact, return back, and I will do a terrible thing. If there's any, just for the sake of time, be a string, but and then our get server side props. Obviously, we'll make our API call, and return back the fact from the JSON response, and then return that in the props. And just again, these are very kind of simple, dumbed down examples, right? You could add a lot more complicated logic here. Let's say you wanted to do A/B testing, right? Even on your rendering itself, let's say you wanted to do A/B testing, and that A/B testing, would be a prop passed to this component, and this component would dynamically show one or the other based on that, right? That again will all be ran and generated. We say generate, we talk about the HTML generated on the server itself, which is again very powerful. This is kind of how we would go about converting a API call to get server side. I really did not have to do much, right? I'm already fetching the data, right? I'm already calling like an API, wherever that might be, whether it's in a use effect or some other place. And if I wanted to leverage this in some state, I would be able to use like _app to like leverage putting that in state as well if I needed to. So again, I kept most of these demos and most of these examples at high level just to kind of get folks introduced to this topic. But I think it's something that, like, if you're interested, if you are looking to kind of find ways, like even if it's just minor performance improvements, just baseline NextJS would give you a lot. Obviously, the caveats there are you have to be mindful that you do need a server. So like you would probably have like Express is probably the most common, to run this on. You would put that into an EC2 instance or somewhere like that. Obviously, deploying and putting this in a separate on a server is probably a topic of its own, but mostly I wanted to focus on like the performance gains you would get from NextJS here. I think that's all I had for mostly the demo part. Obviously, the flow of the data was one we talked about as well. I think I had that on my to-do list. Any questions? Obviously, I don't think I can see the chat or anything like that.
We had one from David earlier asking, is NextJS opinionated on which server framework it would work best with? For example, Fastify or Express, or is it really BYOB, bring your own backend?
I think most of the examples, you could say it's not opinionated towards, yeah, I guess it's not like opinionated, but most of the community uses Express, and it seems like most of the examples, most of the projects you seem to lean towards Express. But I think you could bring your own server as well, right? Like I know like Vercel has their own like deployments that they probably have opinionated towards their servers as well, because they obviously charge for that. But you also get some performance improvements using some of the Vercel stuff as well. Like the automatic deployments and stuff like that are pretty cool. But yeah, we use Express for ours, but I'm sure you can use any others that are kind of within that Express flavor, right?
Cool. Doesn't look like there's any other questions at this point, but maybe if you leave some contact info for anybody else that maybe reach out to you. And yeah.
I wanted to put a call out again. Just obviously shameless plug, but I'm an Assyrian. I know, well, you're Assyrian as well, so I'll be the one doing the shameless plug this time. But
Thanks.
Assyrian is hiring, and we have some really cool projects we're working on. So if you're ever interested, if you just want a good idea of kind of what some of the stuff we're doing, you reach out to Will, reach out to me. Obviously, you have my information. I'll probably post this. I'll send it to you, Will, the GitHub repo and stuff like that. Maybe you can share it with folks. Yeah, I'd love to see if anyone else has any questions, or just curious about like, if you have like questions about would this work with NextJS, would our application be a good fit for NextJS? I mean, I'm happy to help. Obviously, I'm not, I know the scope of kind of what we went to. So your application might be different, but happy to help answer any questions related to this, Shurian, or just in general, just even to meet folks. I know we're remote right now, but feel free. Cool.
Awesome. Actually, it looks like we have one question that came in. If you have some time.
Sure.
Looks like so David again asked, what are some continued pain points with NextJS? How is the release schedule, and do any regressions exist at the beta or next release?
I don't know if we ran into any specific pain points that are specifically tied to NextJS. One thing that we did run into, because specifically for our application, we had a build once, kind of like we basically ended up building one image, and we basically ran into some like challenges there where like NextJS, the way it does like environment variable configurations. And so we were trying to go the opposite route, where we were doing like runtime configurations instead of like build time configurations in our known environment configs. And I think that's just the default is to do build time. I think NextJS and Create React that both like suggest that, or that's kind of the default. So we ran into some more challenges because of like the server generated aspect of NextJS and trying to do runtime configurations, on the server. So that was just one pain, but I don't think it's specific to NextJS. It was just mostly that something that we ran into. We were like, oh, okay, so like we have to build a per environment now, just based on our configuration that we had passed before.
Yeah, I've run into that similar issue as well. It took a second to like, why aren't my APIs being called or whatever? Because it's, I didn't have the environment variable set at build time. I was expecting it to be passed into the context at server at runtime. I will say though, there is a package that NextJS has. It's @next/config, and in your next config file, you can actually expose runtime variables that are both public and private that you can use at runtime. But it's not out of it's like you said, it takes a little bit of setting up to get it working. But you can use it to inject runtime variables if you absolutely need to.
Very cool.
And I'll say, as far as the release cycle stuff, David, from what I've seen so far, the releases are usually backwards compatible. Like they're not really introducing major breaking changes. At least they're following Symver, so it's going to be any of the minor patch releases are going to work fine. Any major release, they might introduce some new features, but usually they're pretty backwards compatible. And then any new major features, they usually have a version or two that you opt into those new features within your config file. So you'll enable a beta feature or a test feature, and then test it out, make sure it works. And then the next release usually has it built into by default. So you have some time to kind of iteratively upgrade. So the upgrade path seems to be pretty clean.
Yeah, and they do a good job of staying up to date with like a lot of the React features as well, and the React versions as well. So they're pretty quick about that too.
Awesome. Well, Muhammad, thanks so much for sharing this. This was great.
Yeah, of course.
Amazing gains in performance that you shared here. So shaving 2 seconds off, that's pretty awesome. Model sizes, really good stuff.
Yeah, it was surprising. We really enjoyed NextJS so far.
Cool. Awesome. Well, yeah. So like I said before in the opening of the meeting, if you're interested in giving a talk, reach out to me. You can do that on nashdev.com on the Slack channel. there's, or on the Slack server, there's a JavaScript channel. Reach out to me on that, or you can go to nashjs.org, and there's a form that you can fill out, and I'll get to you and get you on the schedule. Thanks again, Muhammad. This was awesome.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime you want to come back and give a talk, let me know. I'd love to have you back.